If a story comes along, sometimes for me that story feels like a magnetizing force, that it's suddenly all these useless parts of you and your experience, they suddenly rise like metal filings, to meet this magnet. And so they're of worth. You can do something with them. You can use something. And so when I have a revelation like that, standing in the streets of New York, who knows why, but for whatever genetic, psychological, spiritual reason, it is within my gift to be able to reach into myself and use what I have of myself in order to make sense of this.
Hello, and welcome to a new episode of Shop Talk with Writers, the podcast where we are endlessly curious about the stories behind the books. I'm Elena Lappin, and my very special guest today is Irish novelist, playwright, and short story writer Lucy Caldwell. Born in Belfast, Lucy Caldwell is a critically acclaimed and multi-award-winning author of several novels and collections of stories, including Multitudes, Openings, Intimacies, and The Meeting Point. She has won the BBC National Short Story Award in 2021 and the prestigious Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction for her 2022 novel, These Days. Her new story collection is Devotions, 8 stories in which the desire for something lost is just as strong as the yearning for what we don't yet know. Here's Lucy Caldwell reading a story from Devotions. Enjoy.
Hi, I'm Lucy Caldwell, and I'm going to read from my short story, The Day He Met Jesus. My granddaddy had a story about the day he met Jesus. It was around the back of the city hall on a Tuesday morning in March. He wasn't drunk. I never in my whole life saw him touch a drop of alcohol. And he wasn't a religious man either, didn't belong to any congregation or regularly attend any church. One day, as he told it, he just took a notion to meet the Son of God. Now, to understand Grandpa Andy, you need to know he was prone to being a bit eccentric. When I was a wee girl, he'd look after me on a Saturday while my mum went to get her nails done or her roots touched up and my daddy played five-a-side in the park. On days when my mum was on the late shift in the clinic, he'd pick me up from school and give me my tea, so I spent a fair bit of time with him. And we'd do things like, we'd talk to trees. You'd be walking down the street with him and he'd stop to pass the time of day with a tree like you might an old pal, hands on its trunk by way of greeting. We'd stand there for ages because you needed, he said, to slow yourself down to the pace of a tree to hear its response. Your average tree has 4 heartbeats a minute, and most people are too impatient, too much caught up in their own hectic rhythms to connect. We'd play opera arias to his vegetables. He'd CDs of Mariah Callas and Montserrat Caballé that he'd rigged up with speakers under umbrellas on an extension cable to play to his cabbages because he said it made them grow better. He said if you put on Lacme's Flower Duet, got down on your hunkers and really listened, you could hear them creaking wide and sighing with pleasure. He'd often send me home with one of those great big squeaky cabbages or lettuces that my mum refused to touch because whatever the magic of opera did, it didn't repel creepy crawlies, and my granddaddy's veg was always riddled with slugs and greenfly, even after a few goes in the salad spinner. Well, this one time, we were walking down the Craiger Road to the bakery to treat ourselves to a cream bun, when 6 men with shaven heads and bright orange skirts came dancing towards us. I was only 10 or 11, and I'd never heard of Hare Krishnas before. All I saw was a rake of Egypts clapping and jangling their tambourine, hopping about and slapping their drum, singing some unintelligible words, as a group of wee lads followed behind, taking the mick, near pissing themselves laughing. But Grandpa Andy, he had this look of pure delight on his face. I remember looking up at him like, what are they like? Expecting him to be sniggering too. And instead, he looked lit up inside, as if the most amazing thing was happening. As they drew nearer, didn't he start clapping his hands and nodding his head, this great big smile on his face? And then, didn't he start dancing himself? One of the men offered my granddaddy his arm, and round they went like they were caling, first one way, then the other. Then the rest of them stood in a circle singing their Hare Krishna or Hare Krishna, whatever it was, and the wee lads yeoed, and women doing their messages stopped to see what all the fuss was about, abandoning tartan trolleys willy-nilly, and the traffic slowed, and car horns beeped, and at first I wished the ground would open and swallow me up. But then, somehow, I started laughing and clapping and leaping about too. Grandpa Andy told me later that the men had been chanting what's called the Maha Mantra. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. He told me that Maha was Sanskrit for great, and mantra came from two words, man meaning to think, and tra meaning an instrument or tool. A mantra, he said, was a tool of thought, something to force the mind. Just as an alarm clock wakes you up, the Hare Krishna mantra was meant to awaken something in your soul, to open you up to some new level of awareness or joy. It was all in the leaflet they'd given him, he said. He said that when he was a young man, he'd wanted to go to India. He'd wanted to see for himself the sort of things he only ever read about in books or saw on the telly. The gurus and the flowers and the temples, the sadhus and their loincloths, the cows with garlands of marigolds over their horns, the fireworks and confetti and candlelight of a Diwali, the thousands upon thousands of people immersing themselves in the river, all the colour and incense and the exaltation. But he and my granny were stepping out at the time, and she was a home bird, not at all keen on the idea of travel, and he'd never gone. It turned out, though, that the men in orange were part of a Hare Krishna community on Inishrath, a wee island in the middle of Loch Earn, practically on our doorstep. Isn't that just wonderful, he said. I worried for a bit that he might take off and join them, especially when he took to sitting cross-legged in his back garden, harrying at his vegetable patch. But you grow where you're planted, he always used to say, and I think, in a funny way, it was enough for him to know that they were there, within touching distance, living their simple, vegetarian, devotional lives. You didn't need to travel to the other side of the world, he said. Everything you needed was right here, right now. If only you knew how to find it.
Lucy Caldwell, thank you so much for this beautiful reading from your new book, Devotions. I think it's 8 short stories, and this was one of the 8. And if I'm not mistaken, this story has been produced before on BBC Radio. You mentioned that in your acknowledgements.
That's right. This story was commissioned by Radio 4, and it was recorded and broadcast.
You know, I never regret this podcast. In fact, I'm very happy that this podcast is audio only. But in this case, as you were reading it, you had a smile on your face throughout. You didn't stop smiling the entire time, and I wish people could see that. Why do you think you were smiling?
I have no idea. I've turned myself off the camera so I can just see you. I think it's a story. It's a child remembering something important about her grandfather, and there's the ridiculousness of the singing to the cabbages and all the rest of it, and it makes me smile as well to think of when I was writing the story. I like the sort of playful subversion of an Orange March, so instead of what you might imagine as orange men marching down the street, I loved the idea that it was Hare Krishnas in their orange robes going down the street. And I think I was smiling as well because I love Hare Krishnas. I've always been interested in all types of religion, spirituality, as the title of this collection might testify. And I was thinking of, my own daughter is 8, And we have a habit on a Sunday where my husband takes my son to his football match, and my daughter and I go to our favourite cafe, and we buy our new book, or we have a new library book, and we have lunch, and we sit and read for an hour and a half. And then we walk back home to meet my husband and son when they get home. And whatever the timing of Sunday, we're always walking back up the hill in Folkestone at the time that our local community of Hare Krishnas comes out of their shop and sings and walks through the street. And I always love following them and joining them and greeting, well, not joining them, I greet them, I don't quite join in, but I do follow them. And my daughter has started to get very embarrassed by her mum, and she always says, Mum, please don't sing as well, please don't follow them. And so I think something of that, there was a sort of wry pleasure in the story as well, because when I wrote that story, that wasn't the case. But even in just a year or so, my daughter has grown up to be maybe a bit more like the daughter in the story, embarrassed of anything that doesn't seem to conform to the norm. When actually I think, it's those parts of us that we need to nourish and cherish and let fly. But it's a hard lesson to learn.
Yes, there's a lot of motherhood, a lot of growing up, a lot of understanding different stages of life, particularly women, but not only women, in your stories and in your other books as well. Before we get into this particular book, which is, I believe, your fourth book of short stories.
That's right.
So I have openings, I have multitudes, I do not have intimacies. Unfortunately, I have your novel these days. I know about your plays. I wouldn't mind if you could tell us a little bit about the sort of chronology of how you evolved as a writer from the plays to fiction in different forms.
Yes, of course. Well, I have always loved the short story form, but I find it's magical, it's essential. The pleasures of reading and writing short stories to me are intoxicating. But it took me about 10 years before any of my own would lift off the page in a way that I was happy with. So by the time I published my first collection of short stories, which was Multitudes, I'd already published 3 novels, several stage plays, radio plays, monologues. I'd written across a lot of forms, and it took a long time for my short stories to work. And I think in retrospect, they didn't work because I was writing them, I was seeing them as miniature prose narratives, and they would finish and they would just be dead on the page. I think of the poem by Sylvia Plath, Stillborn, and she imagines all of her failed poems in, apothecary jars. And she says, they smile and smile and smile at me, and still their lungs won't fill and their hearts won't start. And that's how I felt, my stories, they just weren't, they would kind of flicker with life, but they wouldn't come fully alive. They wouldn't get airborne. And then I started thinking of them, instead of as prose narratives, I started thinking of them as spells. Words and rhythms in a particular order to evoke a certain mood. And at the time I was writing stories of childhood and teenage years, and so the intensity of the atmosphere, the intensity of the emotion really mattered. And so some of my stories had a lot of plot, some had barely any, but they were freed from the demands, sort of narrative demands. They were free to be more expressionistic or more impressionistic, more like poems. And so they started working. So those stories of Multitudes were, I took Joyce's Dubliners as my model. So the stories go from childhood into early adulthood, and they're about maybe the parts of us that don't make it, or that need to die in order that we move on, that we grow up. And I felt I'd hit a seam. I felt I started understanding how stories worked, or at least how they worked for me. So the next collection, Intimacies, the one you're missing, is all about new motherhood. So that's about the intensity of those newborn years and new motherhood, and what it means to fundamentally change from one state to another. And then I followed that up with openings. And openings, what was openings? I was approaching 40, and I was thinking about how hard it is, or what it might mean to stay open to change in a long-term relationship. And I was thinking of the way relationships ossify in a couple, but also between friends or between parents and children. And I was thinking of how there's a lovely definition by the psychoanalysis, the Jungian psychoanalyst James Hollis, about how a good family will not just admit and absorb us, it will let us go and change and then come back. And so I was thinking about how you do that in a relationship, how you do that in a family. And I was thinking as well how in an age of really punitive algorithms and, like very easy binaries, what it might mean to stay open to wonder, to change. And then devotions, I think, is about love, really. Not just romantic love, about all, though that's in the collection, but all forms of love. And I think devotions is about how we get to choose in this life what is sacred, and it's our duty to honour that. And I think it's about the ways that we might be tempted to outsource that responsibility or that power to maybe to our parents, or maybe to other systems or systems of knowledge, religious systems. But in the end, I think all of us, each of us, has to choose what it is that's sacred for us, what it is that matters. We saw that the story that I read, that was it. That was one illustration of that.
Your acknowledgements are extremely interesting. You begin by thanking your editor at Faber for, well, obviously for working with you on the stories, but also for coming to the place of knowing that that you are actually ready to write one. And you mentioned that it took you 10 years to make that decision, that you can actually now write a story that works as a story, and then to edit each story with him as it was written. And there is a story in your book called Harmony Hill, which is about a young musician and the life of a musician, and how music is made not alone, but in conjunction with others, not only the ones you play with, but the composers who wrote the music some time ago, and the violin makers who made the violin she plays hundreds of years ago. There is a sense of collaboration, which also comes across in your acknowledgements when you write about the people who made your writing possible or better. There's a sense of not saying, oh, I just did this all myself. This is how you think about writing as a sort of collaboration.
Well, this collection is dedicated to my editor, Angus, and I really think it's one of the great privileges of my life to have had such a long and sustained relationship with Angus. We've been working together since my second novel, which was about 15 years ago. And the way that we work with stories in particular is I send Angus each story. I'm a very private writer. I don't send drafts around while they're in progress, maybe only to one or two key trusted people. But as soon as the story is as good as I can get it, I send it to Angus and he works on it, almost straight away, usually within a couple of days. And this is so important for me because I can only sort of hear stay on the frequency of a short story, one short story at a time. And if we were to wait until all the stories were ready in draft and then try to edit each of them, something would be lost. I think you finish stories are written for me in a sort of white heat, or at least they're finished in a sort of white heat. And there's a brief window where they're still quicksilver, they're still malleable, they can still be changed. And so Angus works with me when the story reaches that moment where I feel I can't get any better myself and I need his input, and he will send through his thoughts and we will finish each story as we're working, which I think is quite a unique way of working. It's what the stories demand, and he does that, and I'm so grateful for it. And I also thank, at the top of the acknowledgements, my brilliant copy editor, Sylvia Crumpton. And Sylvia, I first encountered when she edited an anthology. She copy edited an anthology I'd edited for Faber called Being Various. And I was so impressed by her, because copy editing, I always tell her, it's such a dark art. You can always tell when something has been poorly edited, but you can, if she does her job well, she makes herself completely invisible, you know, and she goes through my stories, you know, so meticulously, and we have such involved conversations that I love about, you know, punctuation, and when something is an M dash and when it's a dash and when it's an ellipses and all the things, you know, I'm so particular about my rhythms and my punctuation that it's another joy of the process to work on that with someone who's as attuned and attentive to it as Sylvia.
And how it all matters.
How it all matters. Yeah, everything, especially in a short story, of course in prose in general, but especially in a short story when you're working with far less, everything needs to matter. You know, every choice of word, every punctuation mark, it needs to, even if it seems effortless as you're reading it, it needs to matter.
Lucy, this book is called Devotions. By the way, I love your one-word titles for all your short story collections. They're kind of a theme or themes for each book, slightly reminiscent of Henry Green's one-word titles for his novels.
Yes.
But yours are so well chosen. And so Devotions is actually the title story is the last story in the book. But each story is extremely different. They do all connect. I'd like to talk about how they connect. To me, it seems that they all kind of hover somewhere between life and death. Mm-hmm. And what you do, amazingly, you strip your characters absolutely naked. You don't let them get away with any hidden thoughts unless they are supposed to be hidden thoughts. You strip them to the point that that thing that makes them who they are is laid completely bare, and the thing that connects them, aware of their death, aware of death in general, aware of the death of a person they are grieving for, is just incredibly, I would say almost musically done. It has a melody, the way you create these characters and how they very gently, softly, suddenly are completely exposed. So the first story that happens in is Hamlet, a love story, where it just begins as a very interesting story of an Irish avant-garde theatre group in New York. And then bit by bit by bit, with lots of hints along the way, you tell us how she is grieving the love of her life, who is at the heart, at the core of that whole situation, and who she is without him. How did this particular story happen?
Okay, so much to respond to there. First of all, let me think aloud about that idea of stripping your characters back.
Yeah.
Because interestingly, in a different story, there's a story in the collection called All Grown Up. It's the longest story in the collection. I thought of that story as a Job story, like Job in the Bible. It's a man who loses everything he has, and then he loses everything that he thought he might have, everything that he hoped for. And yet, despite all of that, he needs to come to an awareness that love is still possible for him. And that story was so hard. That story took months and months and months. I've written novels that took less time to get right than that story because there were no shortcuts, technically or emotionally, to get to the place of revelation that story needed to. So in that story, I think I was consciously using that Job model of stripping everything away from someone. But usually I don't think of myself, that feels quite cold, doesn't it, to think of yourself as a godlike figure doing something to a character. And usually the way I experience my characters is, I always used to think that I wasn't a real writer because I never knew what my characters looked like. And if you go back to my early fiction, which I'm not necessarily recommending, I think I remember writing in physical descriptions of characters as a way of kind of overcompensating for the fact that I didn't know what they looked like. And then I came to realize with my stories, when I was working with the intensity of the emotion, that it doesn't matter what my characters look like because they're not being observed, or they're not observing themselves from the outside. And as a writer, I vanish. I'm just experiencing the inner contours of their psyche intensely. The story it's nothing to do with me judging them. I serve the story. I sublimate myself into my characters. And so say in Hamlet, a love story, Sonia has pink hair and a nose ring and too much eyeliner. And we only know these details because she catches sight of herself in the mirror of a lift at a key moment and judges her own appearance. If it weren't for that, there wouldn't be a description of what she looks like, because I think maybe this is changing with an awareness of how we all look on Zoom or on, the first thing that I did is move the screen so I don't have to look at myself. But we have an increased self-consciousness, maybe, about what we look like and how we present to the world. But for the most part, my characters, I'm concerned with the contours of their psyches. And I do catch them in moments of the most important moments, which aren't necessarily the loudest moments. And what you say about music as well, I think another thing, I always used to want to be a poet, but I'm no good really on imagery or metaphor, strange or startling or stark juxtapositions. I'm no good really on that, but I can hear my stories. And I think, like the musician in Harmony Hill, I gave her something of my childhood. I grew up playing Suzuki violin. So from a very early age, Suzuki is a Japanese method of learning the violin that I learned by pure chance. My mum didn't have any had never played an instrument herself. And when her young children said they wanted to play an instrument, she opened the yellow pages and found a teacher who took young children. The teacher happened to be Suzuki. It's all pure happenstance. But I'm so grateful to my Suzuki training every day that I write, because you have to listen. You don't learn to read music, you listen and you repeat. And I then moved on to classical music and played in orchestras, chamber groups. And so I'm very attuned to the rhythm and the pitch and the tone. I always think of my stories in terms of their musicality.
The story you mentioned, All Grown Up, I think it's probably my favorite in the book, probably because, well, for many reasons, but I love the man in it. And I think you pay so much attention to what it must feel like to be a man, and that kind of man. That story is very much almost a novel, I feel. I don't know if you were tempted to make it into one.
No, not at all. It's very long. It's the longest story that I've written.
Is.
I think it's maybe only the second story I've ever written from a man's point of view. I'm interested in untold and undertold stories, and in my experiences tend to be those of women, those of women or children or, marginalized aspects of our lives, queerness or lives lived in the margins. But that story, you have to listen to, you have to work at the story's pace. And that's a slow story. And yeah, I spent a lot of time with him, and the story is exactly the length that it needs to be. I would hope that it contains the depth and feel of a novel. what do I mean by that? Maybe the sense that you have lived real depths of time with him.
Yeah.
You know, the story, sometimes we think of a story as a glimpse, and a story can be a glimpse, but a story can also contain eons. You know, Joyce, in A Painful Mistake, he's got a sentence 4 years past, you know, and you can, in a story, you can skim over time like that, or you can stretch one moment. Time is very flexible. Everything you can do with time in short stories is really important, really matters. And I wanted the feeling that with that story, we've been with him through a lot.
Lucy, the story A Family Christmas, you also mentioned in your acknowledgements that there's, I think you call it a psychic connection or influence of James Joyce's story, The Dead. What about that story by James Joyce really means something very personal to you?
That story, it's a masterpiece. It's one of my favorite stories.
Yeah.
What I love about that story is, I mean, we're talking about music, you know, James Joyce, the musicality of Joyce is one of his prose's strongest features and one of his own abiding concerns. So that story takes the banalities of a family gathering and manages to move from there. The story sort of makes a cosmic swoop, as I thought of it, into another realm. And I was making a program for Radio 4 on endings in fiction, endings and new beginnings. And I was going through that story thinking, how does Joyce do it? How do we move from one realm to another, one quantum, you know, how do we move to this place that story reaches? And I was trying to work out how he did it technically, how he did it emotionally. And I was thinking as well that story is about suddenly realizing or intimating that people we love have these places that are and forever will be inaccessible to us, that we can glimpse or that we can apprehend, but that we can never enter or fully understand. So I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about the way that Joyce, he was a young man when he wrote this story. He was 25, and the story ends with Gabriel and the husband. And so I was thinking about the wife, and I was thinking, what might it mean to write a story, to sort of grow this story up and to write this story from a middle-aged woman's perspective. And I was thinking as well, you know, it's 100 years, give or take, since The Dead. And I was thinking of what might it mean to have an epiphany today. Joyce was a great Aquinas scholar. You know, he was a great reader and lover of Cardinal Newman. And so I met the main character in that story. I make her a theologian. And that allows me access to think through some of these big questions about life and death, and about what it might mean to have an epiphany. What's a religious epiphany? What's a secular epiphany? And so the story, I think it's not a version of The Dead, but it's definitely a story that's in conversation with The Dead. And I wanted to do the same thing at the end, where all the rhythms lead up to a moment of revelation, lead up to an epiphany, you know, a sudden new understanding, a new slant of light for the character. So those are some of the ways. There's even a bit of snow. There's not as much a beautiful snow falling as there is, but I had fun with some of the little details as well.
And it's interesting that the question of having a child or not having a child comes up, or losing a child comes up in a number of those stories. Sometimes one has a feeling that you pick up on the themes in different ways, in different fictional narratives within the stories. It's just, you know, it's a very strong argument for a collection of short stories.
Exactly. And in fact, the story that we have been talking about, All Grown Up, that came from a family Christmas, because a family Christmas, a woman decides to end a pregnancy without telling her husband. And I was so struck by, and the story ends before we see her do that, but I was so struck by the thought of, what's it going to mean to have done that? In the story, the important thing is that she realizes that she is capable of such a thing. She's never, ever thought herself capable of such a thing. And she realizes that she is capable of such a thing. And there was something of the energy of that story, that the story was finished, but something of it continues and all grown up. It's not the same characters. It's not the same setting. It's entirely different, but yet it's a continuation. It's in conversation. And this is what I love. I think a collection, not so long ago, used to be maybe the stories that a writer had happened to write in between other bigger projects, broadly speaking, for the most part. But I think there's something really interesting happening with the collection as a form today, where a collection can be tightly linked short stories. It can be much more novel adjacent. It can be stories that are thematically linked. But I think with mine, they're neither of those things, but they all belong together, not just by dint of being written by the same person over the same period of time, because with every collection, there have been other stories I've written, either for myself or for commissions, that just don't feel like they belong in the collection. But when you're putting the stories together for a collection, I do it by instinct, by intuition, by feeling that all of these are coming at something that in different ways. They're contradicting each other, augmenting each other, arguing with each other, but they belong. Maybe on a surface level, they're different, but they have a much deeper coherence below the surface.
Absolutely. And then in the last story, you actually talk about the sort of quantum way of thinking of opposites not being the other thing, but actually part of the same thing. And that's what you experience when you read your book. First of all, that you're in the hands of a masterful storyteller, and you can just relax and see what she comes up with next on that theme. And it's always surprising and new, but also in a very unusual way, I think, deepening with each story, with each aspect. There is a new way of reflecting on that topic. So in your last story in the book called Devotions, the story is called Devotions as well, there's this sentence, I quote, "You sometimes wonder who, if any, will be the people who wander through your afterlife, your stories." This, in my mind, connected with what you wrote in the story Harmony Hill about music being there when played, not just composed, but actually played, but going into the universe and staying there in some way. And for that reason, I think you assign that statement to the teacher who says, play well, so that when it goes out there, it is actually good. And so here you apply that same idea to writing. And I wonder if you think about writing as something that stays there and becomes part of your afterlife.
I remember having the experience when I was maybe 16, doing my A-levels, reading the poetry of Keats. And I remember having the almost mystical sensation that through reading the poems, which I loved, my soul was touching his. There's no, it sounds so woo, but there was, I remember that abiding feeling of something of me was meeting and recognizing something of him. Even though I knew he was dead, even though I knew he died tragically young, even though when he was writing, he could not have even imagined, that I would be, let alone who or what I would be. Yet there was something that the poems were not just a record or an artifact of their time. They were alive, and they were quickened, they were vivified by my reading of them and by my bringing to them, or being open enough or willing enough to bring to them something of myself. So I remember that experience, and I've been lucky enough to have that with some of the writers that I have loved. We never finished the conversation about Hamlet, a love story, which we can get to. But that story, I had the same experience reading that story and writing that story, reading Hamlet in preparation for writing that story. That story is about a young experimental Belfast theatre troupe bringing their punky production. It's a wild production. I have no idea if it would work, but they bring this production of Hamlet to Hell's Kitchen in New York. And I spent weeks on end reading that play because I needed to know it as well as young actors who loved it, who were passionate about it, who had acted in it every night for weeks. And I remember a couple of things. I remember coming out of my study kind of a bit giddy, saying to my husband, this is going to sound so stupid, but I think Shakespeare was actually a genius. Something in the play had opened up for me. I was able to think in it, to move within it. And I had times of writing that story, which is an emotionally very intense story and technically demanded such concentration. But I had moments of feeling this restless, questing intelligence that wasn't me, that wasn't mine, kind of moving through me to see what the world looked like through this play. This play was a window onto 21st century New York, which would have been completely inconceivable, maybe, who knows, to the author at the time the play was written. But I felt yet there was still something alive that was able to access my world through me. I think this does happen sometimes. I think Hilary Mantel, she talks about it's too easy to talk about writing in terms of channeling or things like that. But I have had that uncanny experience on a couple of occasions, and yeah, Keats. Reading Keats was one of them. Writing my Hamlet story was another, and I think it does happen through music. Mm-hmm. That sort of particular immortality.
You add something to that idea a little bit further down. This is about thinking how what we experience is a part of something else that we can't really comprehend. It just happens. And then you say, that we misunderstand when we try to wrest things down to our level and into narrative, into story. That's such an interesting idea. Do you think, as a writer, that when we create narratives, when we create fiction out of whatever it is that we created from, that we might be creating something that is completely beside the point?
That's so interesting.
Or the opposite.
Or the opposite. I mean, I think that if I've been lucky enough to work with theoretical physicists for a couple of commissions, I went to CERN to work with some cutting-edge quantum physicists, and they know and calculate and move in 21 dimensions. I mean, if you take string theory into account, we've got about 26 dimensions. And I think the brain is, my brain just can't conceive beyond, maybe, if we say that we understand our three-dimensional world. If we had time, it's a fourth dimension. 5 dimensions would be all times coexisting simultaneously. I sort of struggle to think and to move beyond that. But yet we know that these dimensions are there. And yet we are creatures of time. We live in time which so much of our science, so much of our great myths tells us is a construct, is an illusion. And so you think, well, what if all these other dimensions are possible? Why are we limited to living in so few of them? And I think the answer can only be that we are in this space-time continuum in order to understand lessons of time, of loss, that are only possible by living in time. I think that's what a lot of the great religions, the great mystical disciplines tell us. They tell us that in order to understand that time is an illusion, we have to experience time. In order to understand that there's no such thing as separation, we need to experience the illusion of separation. What we do have while we are here are stories, the consolations and the wisdoms of those great myths, stories that contain truths that I think are inaccessible via other means, things that can only be apprehended or glimpsed in part. Stories as well, they transcend place and time. They are the closest we come to a technology of time travel, of immortality. Stories are how we, because we live in time, understanding our lives in narrative is one of the ways that we make sense of that. I think there's something about us as human creatures that we need stories. And I think there's something, writers are well placed, though it's not just the role of writers, to question the narratives that we tell ourselves on a personal level, on a national level as well. The stories that we tell ourselves about who we are and how we have come to be. It's interesting sometimes to think, what are the stories or what are the software programs imprinted in my hardware without my consent, without my understanding? How might I replace that story with one that serves me better? So I think that that's a very, very muddled and incoherent answer, but it was a very big question.
If there's one sentence that to me captures the heart of this book, it's in A Family Christmas. In A Family Christmas, you write, somehow it is still too bewilderingly impossible to come to terms with death. Or maybe it is life that bewilders, real, secret, and so on, the mystery of it all. I think that's the heart of the book, but you tell it via all these deeply human stories. We've had a number of Irish authors on the podcast. So we've had John Banville, Colm Tóibín, Fiona Scarlett from the younger generation, Caroline O'Donoghue. And I asked Colm Tóibín what it was about Irish writing, of course, always, but specifically today, that is so incredibly rich and productive and different. And he said, well, even Irish writers who come from a very small area, each one has a completely different voice. How do you feel about Irish literature today? And where do you fit in?
I think Irish literature is definitely going through a golden age across all forms. And I think it's interesting to think there's a long-standing tradition of literature and the arts in general being respected and being supported, financially. This matters by the government. There's a healthy ecosystem of small magazines and festivals and book events. But I think most importantly, if you look at the country of Ireland as a whole, both Southern Ireland and the north of Ireland have in recent decades undergone seismic change. The Good Friday Agreement and the end of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. People looking back and, a masterpiece like Milkman, something that can't be written as a rapid response form, that's the distillation of years, of decades of experience. So we're looking back on recent history and also reassessing Ireland's place globally, I think. For generations, Ireland was a place from which people left. Ireland as a country had a sense of itself predicated on emigration, and people would leave and they would go elsewhere. It's only been in recent decades that Ireland has been a place to which people come. So as a whole, north and south, so Ireland is having to adjust. We're back to the stories, aren't we? The stories that it tells about itself, people questioning those stories. So the referendums that have happened in the last few years in Ireland, the referendum for equal marriage, the referendum for bodily autonomy, the constitution being ripped up and rewritten, people talking about things that have never been talked about before. Both of those referendums were won largely on the power of personal narrative. People telling stories that they hadn't publicly told or that they had felt ashamed to tell before. Stories about the mother and baby homes, the scandals, the breaking of the stranglehold of the Catholic Church. Ireland has been questioning these narratives, reinventing itself. It's a kind of febrile mix where every stories matter and people are working out what are the stories we've been telling about ourselves and how don't they serve us, and what are the stories that everyone knows that have never been told, and what might be the new stories. That's a large part of it. And of course, the more excellent writers that there are, the more everyone's game is upped. Kevin Barry is very funny about this. He says, you can't throw a stone in Ireland without hitting another writer. So you need to make sure that you're defending your patch. But as well, I think that there are writers, like Jan Carson, who writes a sort of magical realism that I rarely write, but knowing Jan and seeing what she does, it sharpens and makes possible more for me. Wendy Erskine as well. Wendy's such a phenomenal writer, and she was actually the A-level teacher who taught me Keats. And I'm lucky enough to count her as a very good friend today. And I could never write the books that she does, but yet I learn from them. And so there's a sense that there are a lot of writers who are reading each other, who are committed to their own craft, who are, the more stories that you have and the better those stories or novels, the better everyone gets, I think.
And finally, can I ask you a question that I ask all of our guests at the end? Why do you write?
I think I'll loop back to the Hamlet question that I never answered for this. And I think where that story came from, I was in New York giving a reading, and I shouldn't have been in New York. I had just had COVID for the third time. I was completely physically wiped out. I was jet lagged. I was feeling a very, very long way from home. My hotel was just off Times Square, that great crossroads of the world. And I wandered out and I stood in the middle of Times Square, teeming with people, like thousands and thousands and thousands of people, and noise and billboards and cacophony. And I had that feeling that is not an original thought, but I felt it with the force of a mystical revelation. Every single one of these people, every single one of us has to die, and we have to meet our deaths alone. It doesn't matter who we are, what we've done. When the time comes, we have to meet our death alone. And I gave that revelation directly to Sonia in the story, but I remember having it. And, it's when you have a feeling like that, like, what do you do with it? If you're a writer, you find a way of understanding it, maybe of containing it by putting it in a story. And that story, I think of all the various things that it drew on. I think of that great phrase of Yeats, the rag and bone shop of the human heart, from the circus animal's desertion. And he talks about, the rag. I think that we're all this kind of mixture of the junk, useless stuff that we have lived or absorbed or experienced or accumulated from others or taken in from social media or imagined, or whatever the case might be. And it's kind of useless. It's inert. It's what's the point of any of it? Well, if a story comes along, sometimes for me that story feels like a magnetizing force, that it's suddenly all these useless parts of you and your experience, they suddenly rise like metal filings, to meet this magnet. And so they're of worth. You can do something with them. You can use something. And so when I have a revelation like that, standing in the streets of New York, who knows why, but for whatever genetic, psychological, spiritual reason, it is within my gift to be able to reach into myself and use what I have of myself in order to make sense of this. And in order to make sense of it, not just for myself, but to somehow transmute it, to turn all that straw into a sort of gold that might illuminate something for someone else.
Lucy Caldwell, thank you so much for being a wonderful guest on Shop Talk with Writers. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
This was Shop Talk with Writers. Our guest was eminent novelist and short story writer Lucy Caldwell. Her new collection, Devotions, is published by Faber. Find out more about her work on my Substack newsletter and enjoy our reels featuring the best clips from this conversation. I'm Elena Lappin. Thank you for listening.